A lot of you are familiar with ONOS and the GUI for ONOS. This is just to give a little bit of history of where it came from and what GUI2 actually means. So the original ONOS GUI was probably developed between 2015 and 2017, and there was a lot of excellent work went into it, and you know, the guys worked miracles really with the technologies they had at the time. AngularJS was called Angular back then, and there's a Java backend for this GUI, and it uses WebSockets, which created a really great experience. You know, dynamic updates to the GUI without having to poll all the time, and there was a lot of revolutionary ideas in it. Unfortunately, AngularJS was abandoned by Google. It's still in maintenance mode, but really they came out with Angular 2 and changed the technology stack hugely, you could say. Angular 2 has moved on, now it's Angular 8, and so the technology stack has moved on quite a lot at this stage now. So what I did is I really I was working in microsemi, and people wanted to see a lot of things in the ONOS GUI. We wanted to try and customize it, and so I decided, rather than trying to refit things into Angular 1.x, that I would try and see if the whole thing could run in Angular 7. Using the same Java backend and WebSockets and all of that kind of stuff. So over time, really, it's been developed from 2018 through to this year, and restructured things a little bit. Made a framework library into like a separate library that you can now go and get in npm.js.org. The topo view is also an individual library that you can download and use in your own application if you feel like it as well. And then there's just the main app itself is based inside the ONOS project. Then, as we started in Micro ONOS, we decided for this conference that we'd like to have a GUI as well. And so what I started was the Micro ONOS GUI just during the summertime. Again, it's Angular 7 based, but this time, rather than using the Java backend and the WebSockets, we decided to go directly for gRPC. So basically in Micro ONOS, in ONOS config, say for instance, all of the mechanisms to do anything with it, GNMI or admin or diags, is all defined in gRPC, and so basically we use a proxy called gRPC web, which translates between you know, JavaScript calls and gRPC, and allows us to have a fairly seamless integration. And I'll give a little bit more detail on that later. The video focuses mostly on actually Micro ONOS, but the concepts are quite the same for classic ONOS, as we call it. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about web development these days. You know, I mean, everybody probably did some web development in college, but things have changed rapidly in the web development world, and one of the biggest steps has been this ES6, which has been followed at this stage now. I think it's probably up to ES9 or something like this, but you know, a lot of things have changed there. There's a lot of object-oriented concepts in there, classes and inheritance and all of that kind of stuff. It's now widely available. Every modern browser supports ES6. On top of that, Typescript came along, which is it's an innovation from Microsoft, and really it's a strongly typed extension of ES6. And basically, when you compile your code, it transpiles back down into JavaScript code, but it gives a great convenience that you can have strongly typed arguments to methods or replies from methods and so on like this. And it helps in QA quite a bit, and there's been a great uptake in it in the web development world, you know, with lots of support from tooling and all of this kind of stuff as well. Angular 2 Plus, you know, is Google's open source web application platform. It's up to 8 now, so yeah, they skipped, I think, a couple of releases, but it's basically every 6 months they're releasing a new version of Angular. And you have Node.js and NPM and Bazel and all of these fun things as well, you know. So there's new methods to build Angular projects. there's a good set of tools as well. Angular CLI is one of the main ones, and I'll show an example of that in the video presentation later on as well. In terms of IDEs, IntelliJ has support. There's Atom, which is a really lightweight, interesting little browser that's got full support for TypeScript built in. And there's Visual Studio Code as well. So just to give a little picture of web development and how Angular approaches it. So, you know, I like to think of web development as being a kind of a solution in 3 dimensions. So you have the content side of it in HTML or SVG. You have the display side, controlling the display with CSS, cascading style sheets. And then the behavior is driven through JavaScript, or as it's called, ECMA script. So if you take the Angular component, then is really a way of dealing with the complexity of web applications. So when you see a web page, it's what they call a DOM, a document object model, and it's got you know, several different branches for every single component you see. And what the Angular component tries to do is have an isolated little nugget of that web page. And what I mean by isolated is that, like, the CSS you declare for that for your component isn't, you know, available and polluting, we'll say, the whole complete DOM, as was the case in many other different web development tools. So the component comprises of 3 things: a TypeScript file, a CSS file, and a HTML file, and also a unit test file, which is also in TypeScript. And they have formal input parameters and a formal output parameters. So basically, if you click on the component, you can get it to emit an event. So you can get formal output parameters as well. You can inject services into it, and you basically refer to it by its selector. So we'll see an example there later on. I have one called ONOS icon, is widely reused in the applications. And like I said, the CSS and the DOM of your component is isolated. So I guess you could look at web development and you could say there's lots of choice, but there's too much choice, you know. I mean, and what I try to do in GUI2 is basically try and just take a single consistent approach, and obviously try and follow best practice with it. So what I have here in the yellow boxes is really, I suppose, top-level structural things. They're not so much part of Angular CLI, but really of, we'll say, general JavaScript itself, you know, that you can have an application, or you could split some of that functionality up into a library and then import that library, and npm.js supports that kind of stuff. That's what you do. You download libraries from it. And there's a whole structure there in Angular for supporting that package.json, and you name the libraries you want to pull in and the applications you want to pull in. Then there's these kind of sort of salmon color pink components are all part of Angular. So Angular's top level grouping kind of thing is called a module. Beneath it is the component, which is the display element. You have directives, which are kind of modifiers, optional modifiers on the component. You have a pipe, which is really something for formatting an output. So for instance, like if you had a date variable and you wanted to you just go pipe symbol and pipe it to the date pipe, and then you specify your format specifier. Services are kind of across all components and across all pages in your application, and there's kind of a stay alive kind of thing all the time, so they have a useful application in it as well. And then these 2 kind of lilac color things, classes and functions, really are the ES6 kind of lower level kind of concepts. So really it's those pink and reddish colored boxes really are what Angular is about, and component is the main visual element, as I said. So if we look at ONOS GUI then, just at how it's constructed. So let's start at the bottom right. So you've got the GUI2 framework live, okay? So this is a library now that's, like I say, in npm.js. And basically it's got one module in it, and the module has several components in it, and I haven't shown the detail of all the components here. And that's imported by the application, the GUI2 application. Now, the GUI2 application, as you all know, has several different pages in it, and the routing module takes care of loading those pages only as they're needed. This is called lazy loading. And so that's why each one of them have their own individual module. That's the level of granularity you have with the lazy loading. So, there's also the topology view. I broke it out into its own separate library so that it could be reused by other projects if necessary as well. And as you can see, the GUI2 library, or the topo library, is dependent on the framework because it's the framework has the mechanisms to go call the WebSocket and retrieve some information, and back and forth like this, okay? So all of these, you know, like the details view is in the details module and so on like this. Okay, so then it comes to extension, and you know, people want to extend the GUI application, and so the structure I've chosen is to make those things into a library. So like we'll say the fault management GUI is a library that can be pulled in. The ROADM GUI is one I worked on with Andrea, and that's also something that can be pulled in, and you know, they're routable, and at the end of the day, they're going back through the framework library, and they're using WebSockets to get their information from the backend. And the backend, like you can see here, is built in Java. It's there's a whole load of Java classes in there, and they're extensible with UI extensions and all of that kind of stuff. And you know, it ultimately connects back to ONOS, picks up flows and intents and all of that kind of stuff. So are for these ones from the fault management application. Just if we want to, I just wanted to dip into the topo view in a little bit more detail. So as you know, the topo view comes up, and there's a number of panels at the four corners and the toolbar and so on like that. So each one of these are components, keeping the same color scheme as before. So each one of those panels are like a HTML component. And then the topology view itself is the background, okay? And this is has an SVG container, so SVG for the graphics, and then as I go along and I have each of the components contained by that SVG container, I have an SVG sort of suffix on the end of the name of them. So, for instance, the background one can display the map. There's a grid SVG I added in for displaying a grid. Force SVG, map, node device SVG, subregion, and these ones with a star have multiple instances. Okay, so basically each host is a component in itself. Each you know, device, each you know, there's several of them, and you know, if you had a big topology shown in the topo view, you could have hundreds of components instantiated. So you really have to be efficient about how you define your component. And then there's a few directives over on the side. There's a zoomable directive and a draggable directive. So each node has, so you can effectively, the directive is about modifying a component, and so basically it means that you can make a host draggable, you can reposition it. You also have things like the layout service, topology service, and the traffic service to deal with updates to each one of those nodes as well. Okay, so this is how it's constructed. So if I can just talk for a minute about the micro ONOS GUI. So this is just to highlight the different approach we took with micro ONOS. So again, reusing the GUI2 framework library, and I'm reusing the topo library, and what I'm getting from the topo library is the zoomable directive and the draggable directive. I'm not using the force layout there anymore, but there are things in there that maybe should be moved across into the framework library so that I don't have to import the topo library every time. But so with micro ONOS, the two major components with it are topo and config, and so there's a module for each one of those. And how we use the backend is We have ONOS config sitting over there with this gRPC, and in the middle we have this ONOS config envoy pod that we deploy, and that is really running gRPC web, which is a service that basically translates gRPC commands into effectively REST commands, and that's what the browser is actually calling through JavaScript. Again, just a little more detail on that config view. So, for instance, like this is just a network change view. I won't dwell too much on this. Here's another graphical layout that I have in this similar style to the topology view. It's an SVG with a number of components in it. So basically, each one of these is a component. And the panel here at the left-hand side is a component, and this sort of path bar at the top is a component, and this here is a component as well, you know. And then I'm importing the masked component from legacy GUI, and the nav component is imported as well. So really everything driven through the components, and also we have there's a few services there in the background as well. And I think the next slide just gives details of some of the components and services from the micro ONOS view. So for instance, the one I just showed first was the network changes, and when you click on a network change, you get the detail, which is another component. This is the configuration. You can have many layers. Each layer can have many container SVG parts and so on like this, and then we have all these services in the background where we can retrieve data from, and pipes basically for translating values. I won't dwell too much on this. This is basically just a quick view of the IDE showing that like each component effectively has four files, and I won't dwell on that one. Angular CLI is a tool for generating components, and here down at the bottom you can see I called the ng generate component changes list. Okay, so I'm going to show this in the video, so I won't dwell on it. So yeah, so let's have a look at the video and see some code in action. Okay, yeah. So look, I was just going to quickly covers the micro ONOS, and basically just talking about how it's deployed on Kubernetes and where the envoy proxy is located. ONOS GUI is really just packaged up and saved in an Nginx pod here, you know, whereas with classic ONOS, we had it inside, it was running in a Java servlet container effectively, like a Java web application. Here what I'm going to do is I'm going to run in this ng serve mode, so it's Angular CLI, where it basically just runs the thing live in a development environment, and it can pass the changes basically straight over and run them straight away. Okay, this is going to move on to something more interesting in a second. Yeah, so the Angular code is compiled by the Angular CLI, the Angular compiler, and it basically compiles everything down to HTML and JavaScript files. And like I say, the gRPC web code is generated from the protos here. Okay, so this is where the code comes from. Okay, so there I was showing the Kubernetes cluster as the pods are deployed. You can see ONOS GUI in there. And this is just the GUI running in itself, and the console view open on the side. So this is the one running in the pod itself. Here I go into the configurations. There's a models view as well. So again, similar to what you have in classic ONOS as well. And as we move on, we'll be migrating classic ONOS to this structure. This is that configuration view, and there's like a history of changes, and you can turn off the various layers. So each layer here is a component, and this is controlling it through a set of inputs and outputs. And this is the one showing the state of the device and the read-only paths on the device. This is a model model-driven thing through Yang files. So what we want to do here, I'm just going to follow an example where this, instead of clicking on the text, we'd have a hyperlink that's going to show these changes in a tabular layout. And so basically I'm just going to follow a small bit of a demonstration that shows how this configuration is done. Okay, so inside the IDE, you have all of your components. In this kind of a layout, you can see all the ones that I listed earlier. And yeah, what I was going to do is just talk about here that there are two types of components. So there's what I call routable components and embeddable components. And so the routable component is a complete page in itself, okay? And you can use the ONOS config routing module to determine how you route to it or what causes it to be routed to. Whereas an embeddable component, like I showed before, has like formal inputs and outputs, and like they're live data. So if you feed something in as an input to the Angular component and that value changes, you will get notified through an ng on changes callback. And so the output then, if you click on it, it'll send an event back up to you. Okay. So I think I think at this stage it's going to insert the new component here. As you see, there's 4 parts to every component, and here I was just going to run the command ng generate component changes list, and it's going to run that and create those 4 files. Okay, so you go back into the UI and you get your new component. Okay, so the place to start is the Typescript file, and it's empty as you see. So here I'm going to copy some code into it. This is a rooted component, so this is going to be a new page. So I'm not going to use inputs and outputs here. What I'm going to do is take a parameter. So there's an activated root service here, and that's an Angular structure that tells me what is the route that got me to this page, were there any parameters passed as it got routed in. And then the other thing I'm injecting here is the configs diag service. Okay, so this is what the proto file generated. And so now I'm going to, I'm just importing these here, and I'm just going to drill into a little bit of detail on that diag service. I'm going to go into the proto file. So what we're calling get changes, and this takes a change request and returns a stream of change events. Okay, so they're asynchronous and they can come back to us at any stage. Okay, so the changes request is just a list of string values, okay, identifiers, and the change itself that comes back is so it's got a timestamp, an ID, a description, and a set of change values. Okay, so those set of change values, each one of them has a path and a set of bytes. The value is stored in a byte array. Okay, so that's something that I'll be coming back to later. Is that within the TypeScript you can manipulate these and you can deal with those types. Here I'm just going to add an import for the change. And the other thing to note here is that, so what happens is I get my parameter, it comes in, I get my change ID from it, that's what I've been routed to, and the change ID, or the next thing, calls this get changes method, which goes off to the diag service, calls request changes, passes the change ID to it, and then as sometime later, asynchronously, a change happens, and I'll get this change event back. And what I do is I fill it into this local change data variable. Okay, I manipulate the time a little bit, and basically I store it. And this is like a live piece of data now, so that basically this can change sometime after the page has loaded, and that's an important thing. Just up at the top here, each component has a HTML and a CSS file, and here I'm just going to look into the HTML. This is what you get by default, which is really of no use to you. I'm just going to paste in some stuff here, and what it's going to do is give me 2 tables in my view. So the top table is like a header. You can see it's going to contain the change ID, the description, and the time. And this is the change data. So basically, when the page loads initially, there's no change data, but then it appears, and I can call on its get ID, get description, and pull the date out of it, and pass the date to a date pipe, and format it in a medium format. On the second table, I have a for loop, okay? So this is basically going to do a for each value item in the change data, and I'm just going to extract the value from it. And I have a pipe here as well. The change value is a pipe that transforms the byte array of the value from the gRPC into something nice and presentable that I can see, so numbers or booleans or strings or whatever like this. The other thing is just the CSS, and I'm just putting in a simple piece of CSS here that's going to color the table with a blue background and white text. Okay, so at this stage I've built my component, and so the component is built, and what I'm going to do is just update the routing table now so that I can route to this component. So anytime somebody puts in a URL /changes and then gives a change ID, I'm going to be able to, it will route to this automatically. So I just do an import of this component, and it jumps straight to the component loads, and it displays the table. So here at the GUI, I just do ngserve, Angular CLI, and it's going to make the GUI available on port 4200. And what it's doing in the background, so I open a new page for this, it's going to attach to that ONOS config envoy, and it's going to be able to retrieve the values from the gRPC. So I navigate to, I keep my console open to see what's going on. I navigate to the configurations, click in device 1, and I don't get the link. I haven't programmed the link yet, but what I can do is I can route straight to it just by typing in change and the name of the change that I want to see. So I'm just going to do that, and I get my table. Okay, so 2 pieces of table, and I probably fairly over time at this stage, am I? There's only like 2 or 3. Yeah, there's only a couple of minutes left in it, but this is showing that, you know, after all of the page has loaded, that the change comes up from the gRPC, and it's like an asynchronous event. So what I'm going to do here is go back to the configurations view, and in that layers panel, I want this to be a hyperlink, okay, and I want to leave this arrow to do what the whole row is doing today. Okay, so we'll close this one. And what we do is we find that config layers panel, and it's HTML, and so its HTML was this one. This is a for loop just for each change. So what I'm doing is I'm taking out that table cell TD, and instead I'm going to put another TD, but inside it is going to be a hyperlink, and you'll see it pasted in here in a second. Let's just delete that one, and yeah, you can see the router link in there now as well. And the other thing I wanted to do is the click previously had been on the whole row, including the tick box and the text, and I'm just going to take that out and put it on the ONOS icon. And the ONOS icon is an example of a component from the GUI framework library. Okay, you can see all the parameters that I feed to it there. You know, what icon am I going to use? How big is it? And all I had to do was save the file, and Angular CLI recompiled the application, and, you know, without restarting anything, I get my hyperlink now, and I can click to the table. I can go back here, I can click another one, and I can get the changes here from it. You know, so this is just to give people an example of what it's like to develop with Angular CLI and the modern tools, and you know, TypeScript is a very accessible language. I would say the template part of this is, the HTML part is the most difficult to deal with. You know, it's where you get the least help. You know, the TypeScript is very good at guiding you along, but you know, hopefully it gives people a taste of what it's like. So that's it, I guess. That's all I had to present. If anyone has any questions on it, I'd be happy to take.
You can see this in action on the show floor in a number of different both ONOS Classic UI as well as the micro ONOS UI are on display there. So
Exactly.
thanks, Sean. This is great. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.